Hi everybody, Micah Hanks here, and it's wonderful, of course, to be participating in Ryan Sprague's Anomicon, and of course to be talking about a subject very near and dear to my heart, anomalous phenomena of the aerial kind, what of course historically have been known as UFOs, what we today call unidentified aerial or anomalous phenomena. And again, there's a lot of confusion not only about what to call these phenomena, but really what they are and what they might mean. And so in today's lecture, I hope to try and go over some of that. The UAP reality, we're going to try and assess this phenomena a little bit and understand really what exactly it might all mean. And so we'll dive right into things. So as I mentioned in the introductory statement, unidentified anomalous phenomena, I do believe are a reality. I do think that there's enough evidence that supports that contention, but there are many who don't think there's enough evidence that make UAP worthy of study, or that indeed if UAP exist, they couldn't be anything extraordinary. I actually hope to try and drive home the point during this brief lecture that indeed the difficulty we have had in trying to document these phenomena is in itself, in a way, exemplary of the fact that this is a unique phenomenon, and one that probably doesn't always have simple, conventional explanations, or can be attributed to something like a foreign adversary of the United States, although some UAP may indeed fall into that category. And a little later in the talk, we're going to really look at some incredible testimony provided by the current director of the DoD's UAP investigative efforts, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, that seems to point to all those possibilities. But right here at the outset, the idea of unidentified anomalous phenomena. First of all, why change the name? Right? They were known as UFOs for a long time. A lot of people want to know why in the world we ever had to change the name. And that is confusing, but it may also be necessary because, again, the kinds of phenomena we are observing, one, aren't always occurring in the air. I can tell you that for decades, information that includes civilian data as well as government data like Project Blue Book, the old U.S. Air Force UFO study, that seemed to indicate that these objects go into and come out of large bodies of water. Most often that is the ocean, but this can also represent inland lakes. But in any case, these objects don't just operate in the air, they sometimes can go underwater as well. And of course, this is one of the more interesting things to me, the supposition that these phenomena also exit our atmosphere and go into space. And although a lot of people would say, well, if these are spacecraft, if they are from another planet, of course they go into space because they came from space. Interestingly, there's very little known public data that strongly supports UAP exiting our atmosphere, but the idea that they might be able to, anecdotal reports that seem to suggest this, and also at least a few tantalizing hints based on government data, to me are enough to warrant attention, and maybe the best indication that some of these objects are at least believed to be able to leave our atmosphere and travel outside Earth's atmosphere into space is the very fact that another term used to describe these phenomena recently is transmedium, and that again simply indicates that these objects are believed, at least, to be able to traverse multiple mediums. In other words, if these phenomena were only able to move through air and water, we might just call them unidentified aerial and aquatic phenomena, right? The very fact that they are called transmedium by definition seems to indicate that they are believed at times to also exit or enter Earth's atmosphere. And that is a really interesting prospect because for those who are advocates of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, a little more on that in a moment, but for those who propose that that's what UAP are, that these are extraterrestrial phenomena, indeed, the transmedium capabilities of these objects may be the clearest indication of that. But even that, the ability to enter Earth's atmosphere from space, doesn't necessarily explicitly point to extraterrestrial technology, since we really cannot rule out the possibility that some of these phenomena may actually come from Earth's atmosphere. They're capable of entering space and then coming back. I mean, take for instance U.S. spacecraft. We have spacecraft that NASA uses, and now that certain commercial space agencies, and of course also other space agencies operated by governments around the world, and of course also those commercial space agencies in other countries, yeah, they of course produce spacecraft that can leave Earth's atmosphere and come back. So even if we've got a transmedium phenomena, that alone does not explicitly point to ET. But when it comes to that extraterrestrial hypothesis, and trying to understand and evaluate really what unidentified anomalous phenomena are, One important thing to emphasize here before we really get into the heart of this lecture is that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is a leading idea that may explain some UAP phenomena that have been observed over time. It is certainly not the only interpretation of what these phenomena are, and in fact there may be multiple different things that UAP represents. Some of them may be extraterrestrial, but that is yet to be proven. Even some of the best UFO researchers from over the decades will acknowledge, we still don't have enough evidence to explicitly point to extraterrestrial technologies as far as what UAP represent. And this has caused some researchers like Jacques Vallée and John Keel and others in decades past to shy away from the ET hypothesis, and they've looked at other alternatives. Maybe these are interdimensional phenomena. Maybe these are, as John Keel surmised, ultra-terrestrial phenomena. In other words, there are a lot of ideas about what UAP may represent. I think in terms of the current UAP assessments by the US government, they take a similar approach in the sense that they say, some of these things may be aerial clutter and fairly mundane things. We're really worried about the ones that might belong to China and Russia. And then there is a small percentage that we just haven't identified that do appear to represent technologies. And as you'll hear a little later, that the DoD's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, is concerned actually might represent technological advancements that some foreign power, or maybe somebody else, has actually made. So in essence, I think that the best approach, really, to understanding UAP is to accept that we are talking about a phenomena that actually probably has a lot of different pieces. There are a lot of things that fall into the category that we call UAP, and we're going to try and break down what some of those different things are, and really focus on what are the more truly anomalous ones. The ones, again, that the proponents of an ET hypothesis would say might be extraterrestrial, as well as those that maybe just the general anomalist would say, without saying what we think these things are, we acknowledge there is a reality to them, a UAP reality. And so now as we get into things, I want to focus a bit on what UAP represent in the historical and scientific context, and how we can more comprehensively understand these phenomena, and really what they mean, what our relationship to them is, whether they represent threats, and how science can be better applied toward the problem so that we can resolve some of the questions we have about UAP. Some of the ways I hope to try and do that, in addition to looking at the history of the phenomenon very briefly, is to also look at what good evidence may exist for UAP. Is there good photographic or video evidence? Is that enough to satisfy scientists? And then lastly, we'll look at some of the government data that has been released on UAP and try to understand what some of that means. As far as the history of unidentified anomalous phenomena, there are those who often state that the first flying saucer was seen in 1947 by a pilot from Idaho named Kenneth Arnold. In fact, many of you out there, if you've read books about the history of this topic, or any books, in fact, about this subject, most often you will see those kinds of assertions being made. The flying saucer enigma, as it was first known, began in 1947, and shortly thereafter, the Air Force got involved, and by around 1952, we stopped calling them flying saucers, they became UFOs, and by 1969, the Air Force quit studying these things because there was a scientific project managed out of the University of Colorado by Edward U. Condon, an American physicist, and he and his team determined that there was no scientific value to studying UFOs. That at least might be a very short and fairly skeptical summary of the history of UFOs, but I also think it's a very inaccurate one for a variety of reasons. One being that if we go back prior to 1947 during the Second World War, we had both Allied and Axis pilots reporting sightings of strange luminous phenomena, mostly seen at night, over Europe, and of course also over the Pacific theater. These objects at the time, especially over Europe, were a concern because both sides essentially thought that they were something that the other had developed. It was some kind of a new aviation or surveillance technology. The Germans thought it was US and Britain. US and Britain thought it was Germany or somebody else. We only find out after the war that both sides, the Allies and the Axis, were reporting having these strange encounters. And even immediately after the war, those encounters seemingly continued. In fact, one of the earliest government investigations into unidentified aerial phenomena took place in the summer of 1946 over Scandinavia with the widespread reports of the so-called ghost rockets that were being seen around that time. But even if we go back earlier than the Second World War, there were indeed much earlier reports of sightings of aerial phenomena. As early as the 1930s, the Italian government had begun to log information about aerial phenomena that they were observing. Around the same time, once again in Scandinavia, there were sightings of mysterious ghost flyers, as they were called. And although the 19-teens and 20s are an era where you don't see a whole lot of discussion about aerial phenomena that was occurring during that time, efforts by researchers like Jan Aldrich, Barry Greenwood, David Marler, and a lot of other excellent UFO historians have helped to continue to unearth data about UFO sightings long before they were known as UFOs or flying saucers or aerial phenomena. They were known by a variety of different names during that period, and that's one of the very things that seems to have made it harder for historical researchers to find data about sightings of aerial phenomena during that time. There really wasn't any consensus in terms of what they should be called. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been sightings that have been found. In fact, one of the more notable sightings waves that seems to involve unidentified aerial phenomena in history actually occurs during the 1890s. There are a multitude of newspaper reports from that era that describe so-called airships seen over the United States, and in fact, similar airship waves later occurred over parts of Britain, parts of Australia. Indeed, there do seem to have been some instances where there were widespread observations of strange things in the skies, and these were reported in newspapers even during the 19th century. In fact, going even further back, a number of researchers like Martin Shaw and Chris Albeck and Jacques Vallée and several others have actually tried to go even further back and document sightings of aerial phenomena going all the way back to antiquity. And of course, in truth, the further back you go, the harder it is really to understand what we might be dealing with. When we read especially ancient accounts from antiquity, we have to take into consideration people's cultural perspectives at the time, their belief systems. We have to take into consideration what they didn't know about celestial phenomena that might be well understood today. And we have to try and decipher those things from the sometimes rather vague accounts that they provide. But even if only a small number of the reports from history going back to antiquity do seem to describe phenomena similar to the kinds of UAP that we are talking about today, I think a good case can be made for the idea that UAP are something that humans have been experiencing for a long time, whether or not they all represent the same thing. Again, this comes back to the point I made at the outset. UAP is a term we use for a broad range of different phenomena. And of course, trying to understand what all of them are and whether some indeed represent exotic phenomena, maybe something extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or what have you, that's really what interests me as a researcher. So to summarize, UAP is a phenomenon that humans I think have been experiencing for a very long time. And indeed, I do think that there's historical precedent for there having been UAP sightings well in advance of 1947. But we can't deny the fact that with modern technology, especially things like radar and other technologies that were first implemented after the Second World War, it has really helped the UAP that were once only seen by humans to be instrumentally corroborated. With radar and other technologies, in other words, we now have a sensory capability outside of the human senses that when we see something or hear something or have an experience with UAP, if those sensors detect it as well, we can say, hey, that wasn't just my imagination. Our radar seems to have detected that object. Our radiation meters over here are detecting radiation in abundance. Our cameras were trained on the object at the time. The heat signatures the thing was giving off in the infrared clearly indicate that there was an object there, and we can't define what it was. It doesn't seem to have produced any propulsion system. So while the history of the phenomenon is definitely something that I think in the broader picture of UAP will help us understand how long this has been ongoing and what the longer-term human experience with UAP has been, it is the fact that we now have technology that corroborates the anecdotal reports that make the modern sightings, especially the ones in the 21st century, of such significance. And so that, of course, brings us up to the present day and the current state of the UAP question. Because over the course of the last half of the 20th century, we went from there being a real concern about what UFOs might be, to the Air Force being concerned about how much longer it was going to have to study these things. Again, I mentioned the University of Colorado project, which attempted to look at this phenomenon scientifically, but unfortunately, I don't think, on close examination of that study, that they were truly scientific and unbiased. I think that there are a lot of problems with that study, and the bias is exerted by some of the principal investigators, but especially by the director of the project, Edward Condon. I mean, it really seems to show that they went into this with their minds made up that there was no such thing as a UFO, and that all UFO sightings could be explained, and ultimately that stating that these were their findings would relieve the Air Force of their duties in having to study these things. The net effect ended up being that the press stopped taking the subject seriously, and for many decades, serious UFO inquiries languished. But ironically, I'll also mention that a number of the cases that the Condon Committee looked at were unexplainable, according to their very own conclusions. There were a number of cases they looked at that seemed to represent genuine, unidentified phenomena that could not be explained, that the committee's investigators concluded were actual representations of technology of some kind. Yeah, despite the fact that some of their own investigators said, we've got some strange stuff here, Condon and the project leadership said, nothing to see here, science isn't advancing, the best thing the military can do is just not be involved. And that's what happened for a long time. The media got out of the game too. Now, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, there were occasional periodic waves where we did start seeing media coverage of the UFO issue. A lot of the more controversial aspects of the UFO subject, like abductions, did get some coverage back during the 1970s and 80s. In the 1990s, renewed interest in the Roswell incident from 1947 also led to congressional inquiries and a U.S. Air Force study. There were actually 2 reports published, but they concluded that, hey, you know what, this wasn't a flying saucer. It was one of our own balloons. It was a Project Mogul balloon, but that had been top secret at the time, and so yeah, there was a cover-up, but it was our own stuff. A lot of people didn't buy that story. A lot of people today still don't believe that the whole Roswell story had simply been a Project Mogul balloon. But I mention all that here just to emphasize that there were occasionally times where there was press coverage and media attention put toward the UAP topic, but nothing quite like what we saw beginning in 2017, when the New York Times featured an article that was co-authored by Leslie Kean, a longtime UAP researcher, Ralph Blumenthal, a 40-year New York Times veteran and former editor, and also the New York Times Pentagon correspondent Helene Cooper. That article really was fundamentally a game changer, and I think it set the pace for essentially everything we have seen in recent years, which included the Navy updating their reporting procedures. There was the establishment of a UAP task force under the cognizance of the Department of the Navy. We, of course, began to see reports being issued by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that, although they were somewhat vague, they do provide a snapshot of the government's inquiries into UAP. We saw congressional hearings follow that. And then, of course, we also saw legislation by lawmakers, which led to the official establishment of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office within the DoD, which is currently headed by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. Now, one of the most recent serious developments regarding UAP, I actually had a hand in because my website, thedebrief.org, which I co-founded in late 2020 with researchers Tim McMillan and NJ Banias, but we actually published an article by those 2 authors, Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, who had been the main authors behind the 2017 article in the New York Times. They dropped quite a bombshell follow-up that our publication, The Debrief, featured on June 5th, 2023, which was the first article, in fact, it was the first form of media anywhere, that brought the story of whistleblower David Grush to public attention. And following the publication of that article, there was a lengthy interview featured by News Nation, and there's been other coverage too, but much to my surprise, when we published that article, I realized it would be big. But within just a few weeks of it going online, we also saw more congressional hearings, and that in addition to new legislation that I presume is going to be passed into law early next year or late this year in the next National Defense Authorization Act. And so it's been an incredible last few years really watching this whole UAP situation unfold. But now that we've covered the history and some of the current events that are happening in the UAP dialogue right now, I want to look at the UAP evidence, which is really the main focus of this talk. And we'll begin with technological UAP video and imagery. I add the word technological in there because, as I may touch on briefly before we wrap things up, there are other forms of UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena or anomalous phenomena, that I think are probably natural, but by definition do qualify as being UAP and certainly qualify as being things worthy of scientific attention. But now the technological UAP are some of the ones that really interest me. Now, one of the longest lasting problems when it comes to UAP really involves the paucity of good video and photographic data about this phenomenon. Some of the best examples really that we currently have include the so-called USS Nimitz video. This footage, although it's grainy, it's fuzzy, there have been a lot of critics who have said that you can't make out anything from this video. To the contrary, it's actually some of the best footage that we have, and there's quite a lot that we can discern from this footage, especially if we combine it with the commentary that has been provided by, for instance, the guy who actually captured the footage, Chad Underwood, who at the time was a weapons systems officer. He is now a commander. But Chad Underwood has said a lot of things about this footage. First, a quick refresher on how it was obtained, when it was obtained, and what those involved have said about it. Back in November 2004, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group 11 had been conducting training operations off the California coast, and for weeks they said that they were picking up unusual things on their phased array radars, which were these new radar systems that had just been implemented by the Carrier Strike Group. In fact, I think that the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group had been the very first, or one of the first, to institute some of these new radar systems. And after initially thinking that these were faulty targets or that they were picking up things that weren't actually there, eventually there was a target detected off the Baja California coast, and pilots Dave Fravor and Alex Dietrich were vectored out there in their FA-18 Super Hornets to investigate what this object might be. When they arrived, they say they saw kind of a rolling disturbance down at the surface of the ocean, and there was this object that was moving erratically over the surface. And as Commander Dave Fravor, the leader of the squadron, heads down to get a closer look, he says this oblong, pill or tic-tac shaped object flies up toward him and zips past him and essentially vanishes. Shortly after that, the radar operators on board the USS Princeton, Gary Voorhees and Kevin Day, tell the pilots that the object is on radar again, and they've now detected it at their cap point, which was a designated point that they were using for their training exercises that day. But there was no additional visual at that time. They only had detected what they presumed to be the object on radar. So returning to the ship, Commander Fravor tells Chad Underwood be on the lookout, and when he flies back out and they continue these training operations, another anomalous trace is detected on radar, and so Underwood's aircraft is vectored out there. And indeed, he gets a lock on an object, which he says immediately begins jamming his radar. And he says, while this thing is obviously attempting to keep me from being able to get a lock on it, I'm switching through every different kind of measure I have available on the Atfleer targeting pod system by Raytheon, which his aircraft was equipped with. And he says, I'm trying to switch through all the filters and collect as much data as I can while I'm filming this thing. And so, while it's just a few short seconds of footage, I think that if you put it into the context of what Fravor and Dietrich and others had seen, what the radar operators were detecting, what Chad Underwood describes as he is trying to film this thing while it's trying to jam his radars, if you take all of this data into consideration, along with a few of the instances during that footage where the object is clearly seen to be pill or tic-tac shaped, despite the low resolution of that footage, you can pretty clearly make out the shape of the object. You can see the light reflecting off its exterior. The skeptics who have tried to say it might be a Pelican or a distant 747, I think that's pretty absurd because the footage, lacking though it is, still conveys a pretty good representation of an object that is a good match for the visual descriptions provided by Fravor, Dietrich, and others. So again, the pilot observations, the video footage, the testimony from the radar operators. The radar data, mind you, was never released. There are a lot of stories about individuals coming on board the ship and actually acquiring those data bricks, and we'll probably never see that. But presumably there was radar data obtained too. In fact, we know that. And so all of this information put together, to me, represents a good case, probably one of the best in recent memory. And it's that supplemental data, too, that helps drive home the significance of this footage. Again, those so-called experts, a lot of scientists, who look at this and say it's just a fuzzy video, they are missing the point, and they aren't looking at all of the additional supplemental contextual information that makes this video so important. Plain and simple. Now, fairly recently, there are a few other examples of footage and imagery that have emerged that reportedly show UAP. A couple of notable examples include the so-called Middle East orb that was first revealed in April 2023 by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick during a Senate hearing. We also have the Mosul orb, which was leaked. This one wasn't released officially, but it does seem to show an object similar to the one that Kirkpatrick shows us in that video from back in April. We also have some of the latest findings by the all-domain anomaly resolution. Dr. Kirkpatrick also shared these during the Senate testimony back in April, where he shared a slide with all of this data The significance of that being the fact that this information previously was withheld not only from both of the ODNI reports on UAP, but also from a redacted version that was obtained by researcher John Greenwald that did show in the back there was an appendix that provided this information, but it hadn't been cleared for release. There were black bars over most of that information when John got that copy. Well, as of April, we now have that information, and in fact there was an updated version of the same slide that Sean Kirkpatrick shared during a NASA event describing the current work of its own UAP independent study earlier this year as well. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to show a quick segment from that Senate hearing in April, because although the more recent congressional hearing featuring testimony from Dave Fravor, David Grush, and Ryan Graves, that's the one that's really been commanding the public's attention. But during the Senate hearing, which wasn't as widely publicized and certainly wasn't as well attended, back in April, where Sean Kirkpatrick spoke with Senator Gillibrand of New York and several others, there was something very important that Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick said. I want to feature a quick clip of him where he describes what concerns him in the current data the Arrow has collected.
The ODNI annual threat assessment states that China's space activities are designed to erode U.S. influence across military, technological, economic, and diplomatic spheres. Likewise, Russia will remain a key space competitor. In the course of your work, have you become aware of any Chinese or Russia technical advancements to surveil or attack U.S. interests?
So that's a great question. Part of what we have to do as we go through these, especially the ones that show signatures of advanced technical capabilities, is determine if there's a foreign nexus. Mm-hmm. That's really hard if what we observe doesn't have a Chinese or Russian flag on the side of it. Now, I think it is prudent to say of the cases that are showing some sort of advanced technical signature, of which we're talking single percentages of the entire population of cases we have. I am concerned about what that nexus is, and I have indicators that some are related to foreign capabilities. We have to investigate that with our IC partners, and as we get evidence to support that, that gets then handed off to the appropriate IC agency to investigate.
So as we heard Dr. Kirkpatrick describing right there are some things that he says Arrow has collected that to him indicate the possibility that Russia or China may have made some significant advancements, but notice that he is describing that nexus. He says he has no clear indication that Russia or China are behind the things that he has observed. He gives us no idea what these things may be, but he does say that he has seen something, maybe several somethings, that seem to indicate a technological breakthrough or some kind of a technology that we simply can't explain. Now, I don't want to read too much into what Dr. Kirkpatrick says there, but it does sound like he is saying there are some technologies that have been observed. We aren't sure what they are. Our concern is that this might be Chinese or Russian technology, but for now they remain unidentified. So Dr. Kirkpatrick is essentially saying right there are some things that I have seen, I don't know what they are, and indeed that to me is probably one of the most interesting takeaways that we have seen currently from Arrow's findings, along with, of course, all the data that they've been willing to share since the Senate hearing in April. And finally, as we're wrapping up, I've mentioned there are other varieties of UAP that are worthy of study. For instance, very close to where I'm located in western North Carolina, there are what are known as the Brown Mountain Lights that appear to be a variety of luminous phenomena seen at night around the vicinity of the Linville Gorge. I've been studying these for years, and in fact, there are some really interesting photos that have been obtained over the years, one by Bruce Roberts back, I believe, in the 1960s. A colleague of mine, Bill Fox, took long exposure photos of what he believes to have been one of the lights back in the early 2000s. And as recently as February 2023, my friend Jessie Lee has also gotten photographs when she and her colleagues visited Wiseman's View there in the Linville Gorge just a few months ago. They got some really extraordinary footage of what, again, may be the kinds of lights that I think others have photographed over the years, and really trying to evaluate what these Brown Mountain Lights may be is a side project I've had going for a long time, but I've more recently been trying to formalize a study involving those phenomena, and that is a smaller part of a broader UAP research initiative I'm currently undertaking, about which I hope to be able to say much more in the weeks ahead. And so in conclusion, what does all this mean? Now, there are critics that conclude that the current data being collected on UAP doesn't amount to anything. It's not enough to constitute even a topic worthy of study. But to me, things that we have discussed in this brief talk and some of the imagery and things that we've talked about, what it really conveys isn't a nothing burger, but instead a problem that is uniquely complex in terms of its dynamics and behavior. Even our very best sensory capabilities and tracking abilities, video, infrared, and otherwise, have difficulty resolving these objects. But according to Dr. Kirkpatrick and others, there are indeed other videos that have been obtained other than the ones that have been made publicly available. And as we've heard Dr. Kirkpatrick say, indeed there seem to be things that he believes indicate technological advances that concern him. And on that point, the fact that many representations of UAP do appear to be technologies, to me, understanding the full scope of these, including their possible origins, their relationship to terrestrial events, and the potential challenges they may represent, should really be primary focuses of any UAP study, governmental, academic, or otherwise going forward. And so that essentially kind of wraps up this very brief debrief on the UAP issue. As always, of course, you can follow my work at micahhanks.com, and my team and I are frequently reporting on the latest developments regarding UAP and, of course, all kinds of other science and technology over at thedebrief.org. If any of you have questions, I'm always happy to try and take a little time to answer those and correspond, so you can write to me, info@micahhanks.com. And I want to thank Ryan Sprague for having me speak this year at the Anomicon. Hope to see all you guys again really soon.